My name is Jon M. Sweeney, and I am the book reviewer here at spiritualityandpractice.com. I'm guessing that you might know our guest. Her name is Rabbi Tirzah Firestone, and she is an author and a Jungian psychotherapist and a leader in the Jewish renewal movement. Her previous books include one called With Roots in Heaven, that many of you probably know. She is joining us from Boulder, Colorado, where she lives, and we're going to be talking about her book, Wounds into Wisdom, which published about exactly a year ago, but we haven't had a chance to talk with her until now. This book is a powerful book about trauma, intergenerational trauma, with endorsements by people like Susanna Heschel and Gloria Steinem. Definitely a conversation that is important for us to have now, always, but especially now, perhaps in this moment. So welcome and thank you for being with us, Tirzah Firestone.
Thank you, John. Lovely to be here with you. I've looked forward to this.
So I wanted to jump into your story. I mean, it seems to me you wrote this book because you have some personal experience that you draw upon. And for people who don't know the book yet, I wanted to start in this place of you telling a little bit about your story. I have my book open to chapter 5, which is where you call it the terrible gift. Could you just introduce us to how you realized the power of intergenerational trauma through your own family experience?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. I think all of us wake up to more slowly. For me, it was a slow awakening to the matrix that I was born into, understanding, becoming a professional Jewish leader in the Jewish community, but and then understanding in a sense, the psyche and the psychology of Jews, of Jewish people, and harking back to my own matrix to understand that there were complexities and difficulties that were felt in our home, in my home of origin, that were actually reverberations or echoes from previous generations that were in constant momentum, a constant motion, and that these were playing out in behaviors and residues in the Jewish community that I was noticing. I was starting to wake up slowly, like, look at these patterns, the patterns of behavior, the patterns of interaction, and understanding finally, as I was studying psychology and trauma science, oh my gosh, all of a sudden a waking up that these were residues from trauma, that these were behaviors that were unconscious and put upon me and my siblings and others in my generation that were actually unconscious, unwitting patterns that were the residues of extreme life circumstances. Now, some of these are just funny behaviors, cultural behaviors, but some of them are actually unhealthy. And I was starting to understand that, working as a professional Jew in the community, but also working as a psychologist. And then also I would add one more piece, which was working as a human rights activist, being part of groups such as Rabbis for Human Rights in Israel and in the West Bank, and seeing that there were patterns at play that were, in a sense, reiterations of former historical traumas on us, and understanding that no political movement would really be able to happen until we could understand, see, and recognize these patterns that we were enacting. That there's one of the I'll just say one more thing here. One of the interesting and puzzling hallmarks of trauma is this unconscious need to reenact injury on ourselves or on others. That's not a Jewish thing. That is just a human nature. We tend to reenact the things that have befallen us on ourselves or on others as a way of perhaps like a repetition, compulsion, maybe to master them. But here we are doing that again. So I'll cede the floor to you, Jon, and can take it away.
No, the floor is yours. I'm just asking the questions, but thank you. And I'm going to just remind people that this is Spirituality and Practice, and thanks for joining us on Zoom. We were trying to make it happen on Facebook Live, and it was not working. So thanks for following us here with the Zoom link. We will also have this recording available later to everyone and on YouTube and so on. I'm here with Tirzah Firestone, and you're going to have a chance to ask your questions of her. I'm going to ask the first several, and then I'm going to look to the chat where hopefully you're going to put your questions there and I will pose them on your behalf. So thank you for that opening, Tirzah. And I don't need to tell you that you're a beautiful writer, but I'm going to give an instance of it to everybody. So I have my book open to page 97. And one of the things that I underlined was part of your personal story. So I'm going to read it to you and then ask you about it. When Dad returned later that year, his eyes were still filled with death. He had no room in his heart for his tiny children, no patience for their needs. Our mother, too, was numb and absent. Stumbling about on a new continent, she soon had a house clamoring with children, but her head was full of ghosts. That really caught me. The language caught me, and a head being full of ghosts caught me. On the next page, I remember I noted where you wrote, "We are porous beings," porous, P-O-R-O-U-S, porous beings, and children especially so. And you were a child at this time. Can you tell us about what you were talking about there?
Yes, thank you. I was born in 1954, so the echoes of World War II were still very alive for myself and for my siblings. My mother was a refugee. She got out of Nazi Germany in 1939 by the skin of her teeth. And my father was an American boy from Brooklyn who enlisted, and because he knew some German, he was sent right into Germany, and he ended up in Bergen-Belsen in 1945 during the liberation. And so he saw things that were just heinous. As a young man, as a young woman, they came together, began a family, but they had not processed, they hadn't metabolized the immense losses. My mother lost scores of cousins, uncles, and aunts. And my father saw things that rigidified in him and sort of defined his politics and defined his parenting style and made him extremely rigid. So that was that unmetabolized, unprocessed trauma that was stuck in them came out in my mother's milk, so to speak, came out in my father's rage, came out in their dogma, their dogmatic form of Judaism and parenting. And then each of us, myself and my siblings had to struggle with that. Like, where was that coming from? It only, to continue about your first question, it only dawned on me much later. Once I started studying psychology and trauma science, they were trauma survivors. That was what was prevalent, but of course unconsciously so, and we were all suffering from that residue.
Yeah. Part 2 of your book, we're talking about wounds into wisdom. Part 2 is where you start to get to helping people solve the problem after you've described intergenerational trauma and what that is. And you start part 2 with a quote from Torah. The author of the passage, I'm guessing it might not be Moses, but the author of the passage expressing a profound psychological truth, I guess. And it goes like this, Deuteronomy 5:9. God remembers the sins of the fathers upon their children, even unto the third and fourth generations. And you talk in the book a lot about working with children, working with former soldiers, working with people who live this out in their lives. Who else do you work with, in your practice? I mean, you have a psychotherapy practice where you deal with trauma with patients all the time, right? I mean, can you give us a couple of sort of examples of the kinds of situations you come across regularly?
Mm. I do. I work with all kinds of people who, and the interesting thing that I didn't foresee in writing this book is that the the whole field of ancestral healing has opened up, and there's been a kind of global fascination with ancestral or intergenerational healing. So, excuse me, people from all over the world are now interested in this, looking to see what has landed in them that was perhaps the unfinished life stories of their grandparents, their escapes, their dislocations, their poverty, the enforced, the kind of racism that they endured, and how those strains of those unfinished stories have landed in people today. So I'll just say for one thing that's what's occurring to me right now during COVID. A couple of people contacted me that were just absolutely beside themselves in the lockdowns, in the kind of this is perhaps in the year before the vaccines came out, or the months before the vaccines came out, and the terror that they were living, and in understanding their anxiety and their fear that had just taken over and were creating different kinds of symptoms, it became clear that they're, in one case, the parent, and in another case, the grandparents of these patients had been hidden in World War II, that they were actually like Anne Frank, or were hiding themselves, or were hidden by righteous Gentiles, and were locked in attics, or in one case, hidden in a barn. And that terror somehow had translated itself into this unconscious and seemingly inordinate fear and anxiety of being locked down and locked in by the people in 2020. So that was just a kind of graphic sense. But also I work a lot with dreams, and the dreams of patients often are extremely dramatic, and sometimes it occurs that a younger generation will actually dream the unknown life story of a predecessor, of an ancestor, and that is not as unusual as one would think. I've heard that several times now, where a young person in the 2020s in this decade has a dream that is a retelling of the kinds of traumas that the grandparent, in one case I'm thinking of, had never heard the story, and yet had reenacted in her psyche, and that was one of her a recurring nightmare that happened from the very beginning of her recollection, of her memory as a 2 and 3 and 4-year-old. This recurring nightmare, which was actually the story of a grandfather that had never been told to her. So fascinating. It's been fascinating to work with people, literally from all over the world, who are dealing with ethnic and racial issues of discrimination and isolation that come down to us. So all an amazing advertisement to do our work while we're living it, as if possible. Of course, we are living through right now a couple of very, very serious wars. And, when people are in survival mode, they can't process. They're not doing therapy. They're not able to work on their dreams. They're not able to work on their anxiety. They are living, they're in a hyper aroused moment in their lives, trying to survive. So of course, there's no fault and certainly no judgment about people not having the opportunity like we do, living in relative peace to do our life work, looking at ourselves.
Do we need a therapist in order to go through this kind of process? I mean, what's the role of self-awareness, of self-healing as compared to working with a therapist? I mean, sometimes we may not know we have this trauma, right?
That's right. I think the big word that comes up when I hear you ask that beautiful question is grief. You know, a lot of our work today, but also in every moment of history, is just grieving the losses as they occur. Sometimes we don't have time or the opportunity to do that, but often we try to look beyond or look past or jump over or in some way defer our grief. And grief is really, that is really a catch-all for trauma, for residues in the body. When we don't grieve, we tend to, it tends to come out sideways in bizarre and sometimes mean-spirited behaviors. It's a kind of a strange phenomenon. So that would be, no, you don't need a therapist to feel your feelings. Sometimes it helps if you have the resources to get a therapist, to ask the poignant questions and to probe and prod. But if as a culture we could just feel more and grieve more, I think we would be a lot better off.
I'm Jon Sweeney here talking with Tirzah Firestone about her book, Wounds into Wisdom. And I'm going to turn to your questions in about 10 minutes or so, but I still have a few more of my own. You offer 7 principles for healing. That's what part 2 is all about. And some of those principles seem quite Jewish and some not so much. I mean, one of them is redefining Jewish chosenness. So that's, quite Jewish. But others are things like finding new community, facing the loss. So I want to ask, what is Jewish specific about this topic, about this malady, and what is not necessarily Jewish about it?
Since writing, all my data came from Jews that live around the world. Those were my research subjects. Once I got the book together and got my research together and coalesced, I realized this is absolutely not a Jewish book. But because my research was about Jews, it certainly was salient for Jews, for a Jewish population, but it is universal. I would say that whenever I'm going to say something a little strong, but in the 6th principle, redefining Jewish chosenness, I would say that is an international, that is a universal issue. Whenever one people, one group, one person deems themselves to be supreme or triumphant or in any way better than another or the rest of humanity, there are going to be some very dire problems. And we see this in the world today. What gives the right of one nation to aggress upon another nation, a sovereign nation? That can only come from a psyche that tells us that we are more entitled. And so that's a real problem wherever that's not a Jewish problem. That's a problem in the psyche that does not understand that all of us are created with a divine. Some of us have more opportunities or more advantage. Some of us have different genetic structures or have different intergenerational privilege, but we're all created from the same source. And another, I would just point out, resisting the call to fear and blame and dehumanize others, to others. That's a real problem in this world, and that is also at the source of so much war. There cannot be mass killings or mass bloodshed without first there being some form of, we call it alterity, which is just a fancy word for othering. And that is extremely potent and poignant right now as we go into 2024 with the wars that are blazing, how we dehumanize other beings, and that usually comes from fear. So the principle of resisting the call to fear, blame, and then dehumanize, which is really the subset for killing, for violence. It's really hard to, unless you're fairly deranged or mentally unstable, to dehumanize and commit violence on someone you've broken bread with, or you have had coffee with, or it's so behind a wall. If you put someone behind a wall, or you create a mythology about another peoplehood, then it's much easier to commit violence. But I have war on my mind, as you can tell, because I'm probably reading too much news these days.
Well, I think we all have war on our minds. So actually, I'm gonna pursue that just a little bit. I mean, what I am thinking as you're talking is there anything you can do at a time of war, or is all the work you can do in this field before that happens to try and make it so it doesn't happen? I mean, at a time of war, can you run to the people who are engaged in combat and terrible things and say, wait a minute, you need to realize your intergenerational trauma? I mean, what do you do?
That's right. That's the big story, that these things have been going on for generations, and in some cases centuries and centuries. But no, that doesn't help in the heat of war, because in the heat of war, what's happened is that our emotional brain, our limbic brain, our amygdala it has been activated and is firing. And so, as we all know, I explain this in lay terms, not scientific terms, but lay terms in the book. When the emotional brain is firing, the cortical brain, the brain that strategizes and empathizes and has deep insight, goes offline, the prefrontal cortex. You can't be firing with hyper arousal and your stress hormones are pumping through your body, which is what happens when we are triggered, and then we pull the trigger on others. We can't be in that place and also in our executive functioning. So that's either one or the other. Unfortunately, that's the way we're wired evolutionarily. So we do have to be, those of us who are not in war zones, or the mediators, the peacemakers, the statesmen and stateswomen, need to be as thoughtful and as calm as possible to influence from the sidelines those who are in the heat of war. And we're hoping that that is going to be the case from other countries and other international bodies.
You talk a lot about interrupting the cycle of trauma. I think I know what that means, but can you explain what that means, or what does it look like?
Yeah, it's hard to do. I think those two questions are really interconnected. To interrupt it would be to ask somebody who is dysregulated or breathing hard or about to scream or about to do something rash, to co-regulate with them. That means, that's also brain science word, meaning that my nervous system can affect your nervous system. Just by my being calm, I can generate an ambiance. If I'm just me and you, that's not an army of people, and facilitate that person to widen their lens. But first, just to breathe, to change their breathing, and that shifts their nervous system response. It shifts the nervous system from sympathetic to parasympathetic, just calming, getting into a mode of rest and digest. Let's see what's going on. Let's be curious. let's understand and see how you got here. And let's see what are some good choices to make here. So in my calmness, I can help you co-regulate. If you were in a zone of hyperarousal, shall we say, or hypervigilance or reactivity, or just feeling not very, very anxious. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah, it does. It does. I'm Jon Sweeney here talking with Tirzah Firestone, spiritualityandpractice.com. Thanks for being here. I'm going to start asking questions that are coming in, Tirzah.
Great.
Katya, I hope I'm saying her name correctly, asks this. In this time of intensity and wounding, how do we tend to our grief and hurt while there is strong call for action? There is some guilt for not knowing. There is some guilt for not knowing how to come to action.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, many calls. Thank you, Katja. Many calls for action are coming from that place of hyper arousal. We've got to do something. We've got to do something. Can't you do something? You know, like that kind of intensity, because we're feeling so powerless and so helpless to do. That kind of action, however, is going to cause reaction, right? And my taking action from a place of hyperarousal is going to cause a reactive reaction, and that sort of that boomerang back and forth. That's the kind of cycle that we get into when we're in war. You hurt me, I'm get back at you, and then you try to hurt me worse, and then it's just this downward spiral. So to pause, like we were saying, and just feel the intensity of the moment. It's so hard to do that, to actually read some of the things that are coming out now of innocent people, vulnerable people being hurt. And it is, we're dealing with inside of ourselves the injustice of that, and also the powerlessness, feeling our feelings first, and then from that place making calls or writing letters or talking to other people, not from a place of, oh, we've got to do something, anything, let me get my hands on something, but do from a place of prefrontal cortex. Much harder to do from a place of insight and awareness and empathy as much as possible for the heartbreak on all sides. That's hard to do. And again, it's much faster, boom, to go into those sympathetic nervous system responses. And that's why we have such a flurry on social media, where there are posts that are very hyper arousing and upsetting. And then there's attacks on those and defending those, and it's just, and then our nervous systems just are having a heyday. But real forward movement isn't necessarily coming from those kinds of actions.
Which makes me think, there's one thing for me or for you to realize that we need healing or that we are acting out of trauma. But wouldn't it be nice if generals or politicians or parliamentarians would come to realize the same thing, and then could really move the needle? Do you have any experience of seeing this happen in people who are real actors in perpetuating violence and acting out of trauma and coming, having a conversion of realizing what's happening, what's going on?
Yeah. I do know some international mediators who I'm very impressed with, who are, they know that their people are being hurt. At the same time, they're able to step back enough to have the big view and know that it's not going to work to just pounce, that everybody has to feel honor or dignity and work toward that goal, where everybody can have a victory speech, at the end of the day. That's a very fine talent, and not everybody is given to that. I think that there are some politicians right now who are able to hold not many, I'm thinking of one or two. I think the present US administration, Blinken and Biden, both have the ability to be in the midst of really a horror. At the same time, they keep their composure. They're able to stand and work with people who are very heated. So these are hard things to do and to accomplish.
I'm going to read you a couple of comments, and then I'm going to read you a question.
Great.
Maureen's comment, I prefer to be curious rather than furious. Susan's comment, I am a second-generation Holocaust ancestor. As a child and older, I had graphic dreams of being in concentration camps. I kept this quiet as my parents, I thought, would say I was over-imaginative and dramatic, as I felt that I was living in two eras at once. I did not feel crazy, but even later, when I did see a therapist about my own trauma, I never mentioned this so-called feeling of a double life. The therapist I know had no knowledge of intergenerational trauma. Now I realize I never was able to find realistic help. This caused years of hidden pain. Thank you for Wounds into Wisdom, Dr. Tirzah. It saved my life.
Thank you, Susan. It's very moving to hear that. And I hope you know that you're not alone. I cannot tell you how many stories just like that sense of alternate realities. Children who are born and just know this other life, and whether that is an intergenerational echo, some people say it's a reincarnational echo. Maybe it doesn't matter. The point is that your present self and your past self come together with understanding and empathy. And it sounds like you have done that, and bravo to you.
Now, here's a question that gets into some real details about your research, I would think. Nancy says, as a Jewish mother, I was mystified at the actions of Israel and Jewish congregations to impose a mandate of medical experimentation on their people during the pandemic. Was that a result of trauma repeating historically?
Wow, I am not sure I know what you mean. Medical experimentation during the pandemic. I don't know what that is, and I'm naive. I haven't heard about that. Maybe this person can say more.
I'm guessing it's vaccination. I'm guessing it's someone who's questioning the use of vaccinations.
Maybe they could fill in a little bit more. We have a little bit more time. You can fill in exactly what you meant, because that's just speculation, and maybe there's something that we don't know about.
All right, so Nancy, if you can write further, but so which is good, because I I wanted to get to another question of my own, which maybe this is just because I like ghost stories, but I found it interesting how often you use the word haunted. It could just be that you're using it metaphorically, but I'm curious. Are you using it metaphorically? Is there something that's kind of real about it at the same time? It's not exactly a sort of a biblical thing, but I do think of, Saul conjuring up Samuel before the Philistines are about to attack, asking for Samuel's view of what he should do. So, I mean, there is a little bit of haunting, in Tanakh.
With the witch of Endor. Yes, I was just reading that story again. I was not aware of using that word a lot, so that's interesting reflection. Jon, thank you. But I do want to say something that is in probably more than just Jewish mysticism. It's in many mystical and religious and spiritual traditions. The idea that when a life is truly interrupted or unfinished, there are deep unfinished agenda. The soul of the person who lives on lingers as if it's an unwell ancestor, let's just say. an unwell soul who is needing to finish something, to master something, to see something brought to conclusion or to completion. There is in Jewish superstition and magic, there is such a concept as a dybbuk, right? Has anyone heard that word? A dybbuk is a clinging soul. And the clinging soul might be likened to unfinished echoing residue of trauma in a more scientific, from a more scientific frame of view, frame of reference. But in many superstitions or many magical or mystical traditions, like the hungry ghost, there is this lingering, haunting presence of someone who has not metabolized their lives well. So yes, there are such a thing as haunting or lingering souls or lingering echoes or residues of past unfinished business. Let's just say that. Whether or not you believe in souls lingering or ghosts lingering, I don't know, but there certainly is a residue. And we see this coming. Why is this so much in the forefront of cultural curiosity right now? Is because of the science, the field, relatively new field of epigenetics, in which we see clinically, it's clinically evidenced that there are residues on, not in, the genetic strands, the DNA coils that linger from grandparents to grandchildren, great-grandparents to great-grandchildren. The progeny does inherit the unmetabolized stresses of previous generations in the form of changes in gene function. So changes in gene expression. So reduced resilience, even reduced IQ sometimes, a propensity for PTSD. All of these things are known and proven clinically.
Yeah, right. So what does someone need to do who suspects that there's trauma from prior generations that is informing what's going on in their lives today? What are sort of the practical steps?
Yeah, practical steps. I have inordinate amount in Wounds into Wisdom. I talk about a young woman who had this just incredible panic when somebody was late, when her boyfriend didn't show up, on time. Just a sense that you're killing me. I cannot handle when you are late, and that anxiety she came to me with. And told me about. Once it got unpeeled, we did her genogram, and she actually listened to the videotape of a deceased grandmother who had gone through a Holocaust experience and was saying the exact words that she said. She hadn't heard her grandmother say those words, but you are killing me whenever you are late. She had actually lived. She was had lived hidden in the woods, and her sister and mother didn't come back because they were killed. They were found, and so she had this deep trauma. This woman was living out her grandmother's trauma. Once she understood that and had awareness of it, that it dispersed. So what you can do if you suspect that there is something in you that is didn't begin with you, had began earlier in your ancestry, is to get busy, do some work on what did your parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents actually live through. Did they live through discrimination? Did they live through displacement? Were they in a war? Did they live through the Great Depression or the Irish potato famine? What did they live through? Were there addictions? Was there abuse or violence in the family? Start to turn over stones. You can use all the wonderful tools of ancestry.com or genie.com. There are many You look up in the Mormons have incredible genealogical research that you can access online as well. Watch your dreams for clues, interview elder uncles and aunts about their lives. What did they know? Ask questions and start to build out your multi-generational family map and see what were the predispositions of your ancestors. Did they have anxiety? Did they have medical issues? Did they have money issues? Did they have abuse issues? What was going on? What were their marital details? And just asking those questions, you're going to start to see patterns, medical patterns, emotional patterns, trauma patterns that will be somewhat familiar to you. And you'll start to see what actually did come down and land in you. So that's one way to go.
No, it's definitely sounds like a good way to go. So we actually disabled the chat because of our fun Zoom bombers. But before we did, there was a question from Michal asking about the current war in Israel-Palestine and saying, what about trauma on both sides of that conflict? Can you say something about what might be going on?
Oh my God. I think it is so, thank you, Michal, very, very, how can I say, blatant, very, very pronounced that that what is going on right now, whether you call it a war or whatever words, the bloodshed that's going on both sides is ancient. And not only is it ancient reverberations and historical reverberations on both sides of very sadly centuries of trauma on both sides that are coming down and interlocking. But it's also very clear that what's going on thousands of miles away is having reverberations in all of us, because we have cellular, or in a sense, I'm using this unscientifically, of biological memory that is being triggered, cellular memory that's reverberating. So some of the pictures that are coming out of the Middle East are sending people into orbit because they are so much like things that their ancestors have suffered. And so reverberating and inside of us, and then causing that kind of reactivity. It's also, though, an incredible opportunity for us who are thousands of miles away to do our work, to work with ourselves so that we can regather our calm, and, like we were saying earlier, to try to be a mindful, thoughtful, helpful third side from the margins, rather than being reactive and setting into motion more reactivity and more, God forbid, more hate. But we're in the heat of war right now, and there are centuries, really centuries of ancestors on both sides who are at war. And that's why this thing is so darn complex. So yes, I like the approach of feeling the heartbreak on both sides, feeling incredible empathy, feeling the not necessarily agreeing with war strategy or war policy on either side, but to feel that this is, in a sense, the reactivity that's come down, in a sense, of chain reaction. And having that larger view and opening the wide angle lens can be very helpful.
Well, maybe one last question, Tirzah, author of Wounds into Wisdom. You talk about personal trauma, personal healing, and you talk about collective trauma and collective healing. So my question is, what would a group do? A congregation, a neighborhood group, a city council members group. I mean, what would a group undergo to try to discover how trauma is impacting decision making and how to heal from that? Is it possible on a group level?
Wonderful question. That's maybe the best question of all that can be asked, because it's so relevant and it's so important right now. Absolutely. any group, whether you have a little meditation group or you're a city council or chamber of commerce, I don't care what level, to sit together calmly before starting. Even 3 minutes of just sitting without talk and calming nervous systems, co-regulating, as we like to call it, regulating our emotional body so that we are coming from a place of thoughtfulness and mindfulness when we speak, rather than just having to talk and jumping in and springing forth. That will automatically cause others to do so, because as we co-regulate, we also co-dysregulate each other. So any group, whether it's a church group or a library group or a book group, to sit calmly 3 to 5 minutes together without any agenda other than to just be still, like the Quakers. It really had something there. And then proceed from that place. It will change the outcome. It will change your efficiency, whatever your intention is as a group, but to work on not coming from hyper arousal. The other thing that can be done is to have an elected timekeeper, but also an elected keeper of the peace or keeper of the heart for any group. So if somebody is speaking from that rapidity, that sense of reactivity or hyper arousal, the person can just say, let's just sit quietly for a moment without making anyone wrong. If it starts to get too buzzy, too in the sympathetic nervous system, for the person, the keeper of the heart, to say, let's just calm down for a moment. We'll just take a minute of silence. That actually really works. It actually really works. It's very, very simple. Maybe it's a kindergarten technique, call it what you will, but it works, and it will change the outcome of your gathering, and you'll be more efficacious.
Maybe it's not an accident that we were all happier in kindergarten.
With nap time.
Yes, nap time in the goldfish tank and all of that. Yeah. Well, listen, thank you very much, Tirzah Firestone, Rabbi Dr. Tirzah Firestone, author of Wounds into Wisdom. We at Spirituality and Practice have been wanting to talk with you about this book for a year, and we finally got to do it. And then we had
So
a
happy to
Facebook
be here.
snafu and a Zoom bomber, but your grace and your patience are much appreciated. Thanks
And
for joining.
lovely to be here with you, with all of you.
All right. So this recording will be on Facebook later and YouTube. And thank you all for being here and for your questions. Goodbye.
Thank you.